Hi, good people of Africa. I have opened the year 2025 by rereading a very interesting book called Globalization and Restructuring of African Commodity Flows. And I want to reflect on something extremely important. One of the worst things to ever happen in the African policy making system is the discussion in the 90s, late 90s, early 2000s of something called poverty reduction strategy papers. I was a young activist and I was, of course, already planning to venture into a scholarship. And the discussion on PRSPs struck me as a very odd conversation. And I thought to myself, oh my God, Africa and African people have really hit the rock bottom. The PRSPs were a reaction to the negative impacts of the structural adjustment programs, which had in fact been imposed on the continent by the so-called international financial institutions. Now, the irony is that the same folks who are asking us to discuss the poverty reduction strategy papers were also completely closing down their markets for our agricultural products. And of course, through subsidies and so on and so forth, basically making it impossible for African economies to access their markets. Let me read this paragraph for you for more understanding. The marginalization of developing countries in exports of food products can be interpreted as the direct effect of agricultural policies that had been adopted in different parts of the world. Indeed, the so-called developed countries and the so-called developing countries followed opposite agricultural policies. The former closed their food markets and used all means possible to protect their agriculture, including the subsidizing of exports. The latter taxed their agriculture in order to industrialize, increasing taxation when the volume and value of exports tended to peak or even decrease. In a situation of disequilibrium such as this, developing countries could only lose market share to developed countries. So here we were discussing poverty strategy reduction papers. And of course, all these international financial institutions understand that our economies are largely agriculture based and the markets have been totally closed, while at the same time, we are being told to liberalize, privatize, basically the logic of the Washington consensus. So you can see that the marginalization of Africa, the integration of Africa into the global economy and everything else structurally makes it impossible for Africa to make ends meet. This is not to excuse the foolishness of our own policymakers and our own governments, which we must push to do the right things, including bringing to an end corruption and just foolish policies that can't get us anywhere. But more importantly, we must form a movement across Africa to integrate the continent. Think for a minute. The main difference between China, India on one hand, and Africa on the other is that China and India are basically one country, as in China is one country and India is one country, with a huge internal market, even if you just want to speak the language of markets. A huge internal market of 1.3, 1.4 billion people. Africa's population is about 1.3 something billion. Can we imagine the potential if we allow Africans free reign within the continent? Forget about all these neoliberal prescriptions. They are not going to take us anywhere. Thank you and welcome to 2025.